Let's go ahead and get started right on time. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our Meet the Author session with Dr. Clarice Thomas to discuss her important work, No One Can Arrest Our Dreams, Black Men Storying a Path Toward Educational Justice and Freedom. I am Dr. Adeyemi Dawson, Assistant Professor in the Department of African American Studies here at St. Louis University, and I'll be moderating our discussion today. Before we begin, let me briefly introduce our distinguished author, Dr. Clarice Thomas, an assistant professor in the Department of African American Studies and School of Education at St. Louis University. As the director of Teaching Well Institute for School Transformation, her work focuses on narrative research through autoethnography, oral history, and storytelling methodologies. Dr. Thomas is a PEN America Writing for Justice Fellow whose scholarship appears in prestigious publications like the International Journal of Qualitative Studies in Education and the journal Autoethnography. Her research resituates lost or forgotten African American narratives within educational spaces and community projects. Her book offers a compelling analysis of how educational systems often marginalize and criminalize Black male students through their policies and practices, while simultaneously providing valuable insight into creating more equitable educational environments. Now, I like to begin our conversation by diving into some of the key themes and insights from your powerful work. So the first question for today, to open things up, your book centers on the narratives of three men. Could you share sort of, or what drew you to their particular stories on how their experiences exemplify sort of broader systemic issues in education?
Well, first, let me thank you for that lovely introduction.
Yes, thank you.
I appreciate that. We write these things and don't necessarily hear them read out loud, so
Yes.
it feels a little different. But in terms of what drew me to these stories, I had no idea what
Mm,
stories that I would actually have the privilege of coming alongside these men and gathering. Because given the criteria for the study, I wanted to attract individuals, and it wasn't necessarily just men. That's just kind of how it happened. But I wanted to attract individuals who had experienced school suspensions as well as incarceration. So 2 years or more in a prison or jail. And then also were at least 2 years into a college degree post incarceration.
mm,
So with that, I couldn't just walk up to people and say, "Hey, have you ever been to prison?" Right?
yes.
Um, all I could do was create a flyer and recruit and hope that someone responded. And it just so happened that these three men are among some of the people who responded to the flyer. And so the fact that they shared these stories and they were from different regions of the US and
Mm.
had these resonant threads, like I could have never planned or predicted that to happen. So it was
Oh,
by chance.
oh, wow. Oh, wow. Now, these stories seem to carry such weight and meaning, right? The title itself, No One Can Arrest Our Dreams, is quite powerful. Could you discuss how these phrases emerge and what it represents in relation to the narratives you've collected?
Yeah, so one of the last questions that I asked each one of the men, and all of their research conversations were separate. They never met each other.
Mm,
It wasn't a shared research environment. So um, when I asked them all, what is something that symbolizes your journey?
mm,
And one individual said, I was always destined for greatness.
oh,
I
wow.
always knew that I
Mm,
was going to be somebody. I just had to get past all of these interruptions. And he said, if I had not been suspended and put in jail, I probably would have been at Harvard because I
oh,
was always smart.
mm,
And another man said, well, my journey is like Simba. You
mm,
know,
mm,
I'm a king
mm.
and I was distracted from my path, but I knew that I had the keys to this throne and I was coming back to get what was mine.
Wow.
Um, and then the other man said, well, I'm like a turtle,
Mm, mm, mm,
I'm slow, but
mm,
I'll get there, right? So
mm.
there was always this destination of I'm going to be a great, excellent man who contributes to my community, who is going to take care of my family. And prison was just a disruption. It was an interruption on in their greater scheme of who they wanted to be. It never defined them. And
Mhm.
so they were reclaiming their original paths, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
After incarceration. So it's like no one could arrest what was inherently already theirs. They
Mhm.
already had those dreams.
Oh, wow. Oh,
And
wow.
no matter what they experienced, they were coming back and they were
Mm.
claiming what was theirs.
Oh, wow. Oh, wow. That is powerful. So as we think about these dreams against systemic barriers, right? Your work examines the intersection of criminalization, educational policies, and anti-Black practices. How do you see these forces working together to create what you describe as sort of, and I quote, locations where Black and other marginalized students are forced to survive?
Yeah, so based on their ages,
Mhm.
the oldest participant was 29 at the time. So they would have been caught up in public schools that were shaped after the 1994 Gun Free Schools Act and the crime bill that
Mm,
pretty much criminalized the US society. And so they attended schools that had school resource officers. They were arrested as early as third grade
mm.
in the school building,
Oh, wow.
um, where mandatory suspensions and expulsions for insubordination, right, which is just
Mhm.
loosely defined.
Mhm.
And so they went to schools that were criminalized,
Oh, wow.
and they lived in neighborhoods that were criminalized. So the intersection of their experiences meant that if it didn't happen in the school building, it would have happened on their front porch,
Mm,
basically.
basically. And so it was going to happen, right? Oh,
Yeah,
wow.
just
Wow.
because of the time period, and I would say, like, the actual anti-Blackness in schools began the moment Brown v. Board was fully implemented.
Mm,
Once we had this mixed race environment for learning, when we didn't have the proper tools to understand the different cultures and experiences and ways of knowing and expressing knowledge and
mhm,
language use,
mhm,
and so it was pretty much a social experiment in
mm,
which for the first time, Black people and white people were in the same shared learning space.
mhm,
And so with Brown v. Board, we start getting this different language in the 80s about risk, like the Nation at Risk report. And then in the 90s, once we began to criminalize Black life and Black communities, that became a way for the anti-Black practices to be institutionalized through the policies.
oh, wow. Oh, wow. Given these sort of systemic challenges you've identified, right? Your book positions these narratives as a sort of what do you call critical pedagogical tools. Could you elaborate on specific ways educators and administrators can use these stories to sort of transform their practices?
Yeah, so I definitely would not recommend
Mhm.
teachers bringing the stories into the classroom.
Right, right, right.
Uh, that may not be the best solution.
Right.
I'm thinking in a professional development setting.
Mm,
Administrators and teachers are in conversation and they are looking at these stories critically and identifying those moments when the men
mm,
say a teacher did this to me, or
mm,
a administrator called my mom and did not give my mom agency but said tell him to cooperate.
mm. Oh,
And then if they take those stories and critically reflect on their own practices, their own beliefs and ideologies, and then to start to unpack that and do
mhm.
the work, I think that's how they can use those stories as a beginning point.
Wow. Yes, yes, yes. Now, speaking of transformation in educational spaces, your research highlights importance of school connectedness and belonging, right? What concrete recommendations would you offer to school workers to create a more sort of inclusive or supportive environment for Black male students?
So basically, I would say it's in the pedagogy and
Mm,
practices. Like, how do you, we all have standards and we
hmm,
all have rules, regardless of how we feel about zero tolerance. It's there.
hmm. Yes,
Those are the rules, those are the restrictions. But what can you do in your individual spaces for Black males to authentically show up? How
yes.
can you bring the families into
Mhm,
your school environments? How can you even draw from the relationships and the communal ways of being that Black males are naturally drawn to. Like, so many of them talked about their friendships with
Mhm.
other folks, other Black males in their age group or even slightly older, and
Mhm.
how important those friendships were. Even if, for example, Robert tells a story of where they were caught, he and some of his friends were caught by the police.
Mhm. Yes.
And
Mhm.
they negotiated with each other like, "Hey, you don't have any felonies. You just say it was yours."
Mhm. Oh, wow. Oh,
That's
wow.
a major
Mhm.
ask of someone, but to have that type of understanding of, you know what? Okay, I will get in less trouble
Mhm.
to keep you out of prison.
Oh, wow.
That's a bond that
Mhm.
teachers definitely could use to draw on that to, understand Black males a little bit more and create a sense of community
Mhm.
within those classrooms, I think, because it's there and it's
Mhm.
their natural inclinations. And I'm
Mhm.
not a Black male, right? So I'm
Yeah, right,
only
right.
speaking from
Mhm. Mhm.
what,
Mhm.
what I have been told, but
Right.
I think that's one way um that teachers can and administrators have to back up the teachers' practices.
Mhm. Absolutely. Absolutely.
And and so that's, I would say, the relationship building, the bringing in the family, the community, and just creating space for Black males to show up and feel safe and
Mhm.
like they can be themselves.
Yes, yes, yes. Now, as we consider both past and present, the book touches on both historical and contemporary factors. How do you see the historical legacy of anti-Black practices in education continuing to manifest in schools, in today's schools and or classes?
Today, as in 2025, or when we
Yes.
went to sleep in
Yeah.
2024. um,
Everything's such a blur.
if we had this conversation a few months ago,
Yeah.
it would be a little bit different. Um,
Right.
and that's just acknowledging our current political,
Right.
climate, right? That
Absolutely.
I don't know, right? Because
Mhm.
we're kind of in this anticipatory space of we don't know what's going to happen.
Right, right.
Um, but
Mhm.
being as optimistic as possible,
Right. Yes, yes.
um, I I think pre-2025, we had made significant gains to acknowledge, hey, we have an issue with social justice and inequity in
Mhm,
education. I
mhm,
feel like that was at the forefront of a lot of educational scholarship.
mhm,
And I think we had started to make progress in terms of um, the initiatives to even like at the university level to hire
mhm,
more scholars of color,
mhm,
um, for researchers to bring their minoritized their research that focused on minoritized communities into the classroom spaces, into
mhm,
those schools to offer professional development, to
mhm,
have honest, critical conversations, because 80% of the teaching force is white women. That's
mhm,
the
mhm,
reality.
mhm,
But that same majority swings to minoritized communities in terms of the students that they serve.
mm,
So how do
okay.
we bridge that gap? And I think we had started to have that conversation, and I
Mm,
and I think we were attempting to rectify some of that.
mm,
And I just hope that we can find a way to continue that
mm,
work, because even if it begins with just restorative justice, which I'm not exactly a full fan of restorative justice because
right. Mm,
places the blame on the individual and
mm,
doesn't look at how systems have
right.
structured these school spaces and individual experiences. But it was a start that acknowledged, okay, we have to do something different in
Mm,
terms of how do we address behaviors that are not exactly what we want in our school spaces. So,
mm,
and building on more of that sense of
mhm,
community, open dialogue that is asking students, what do you need? What have your experiences been? And asking teachers, okay, we know that your background does not reflect your students. How can
mhm,
we help push you in
mm,
terms of acquiring more knowledge, being in conversation with other people so that you can then take that more liberating practice into the
yes.
classroom.
Mhm,
So
mm.
we have to keep doing that.
Yes, yes, got to continue to do the work. Before we open up to our audience, is there anything else you would like to add about, or talk about with regards to the future direction of this work here? And this is a brilliant book. You can see my tab, so yeah, I've been been reading it. It's excellent.
Um, I don't know. I
Hmm.
guess I will open it up, right? And
Okay.
see what other people want to say. I don't know what I would say. Because I could talk for the whole hour.
Yes, yes, yes. So are there any questions? I think we may have questions, comments.
I have a question.
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Thank you for the work. I think it's very important, especially at this moment in history. Um, you said that, we need to bring family to support our male Black students. How do you envision, let's say, doing something like this where you have a large educational district? I'm trying to, I'd like to hear your thoughts on this because um, I teach at Bronx Community College in the Bronx, and it's one of the poorest district.
Mm,
Uh, and it's a major challenge where you have a lot of dysfunction, poverty, high incidence of health issues like asthma, and a series of social ills,
mm,
broken families, addiction. So just interested to hear, that because I think that's an important piece, bringing in the family, and I like that. And I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah,
Thank you.
thank you for the question. The way I think about that is as a parent, right? I have sons. I have Black sons and I have a daughter as well. But the most phone calls I got were always regarding my sons. And as a parent, it's exhausting to see the school's phone number come across your phone and you think, "Oh my goodness, what now?" Or "Is my child okay?" But then there would be those moments when I would get a phone call that says, "Don't want you to worry, just want you to know your son had an excellent day." Or "He told me that you all worked together on that project and that was excellent. He was really excited." So those affirmations do a lot for parents. And then, so instead of just, there needs to be balance. Like if we're only calling for parent teacher conferences or when the child is in trouble or if you see that they're not engaged, the parent then takes on that anxiety and that weary spirit as well when it comes to interacting with the school. So how do we actually create moments of getting to know parents and inviting them into our classroom, saying, "Hey, your children have done this amazing project and we wanted to create space all day for you all to come in and look at it," and we just engage in conversations. It's going to take a lot of creativity because each district, each school is different, but we have to think of ways to give affirmation to the parents and to the children instead of just, "We have a problem, so now we're calling you."
Any other questions?
Can I ask one?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Oh yeah,
Okay.
absolutely.
Okay. Yeah. So, I love this book. So really cool work. And thank you for being here today with us and sharing your insights. Can I just have I love a moment just in your discussion, and I love in this discussion today where you said you would advise not bringing this into the classrooms. I love that because it speaks to audience of our work, and you actually identify, no, that's not the audience. And so that's a really important move, and I think that we should all, we have, I think broadly the lesson is, what are those audiences of our work, and the audiences that aren't, our work shouldn't go there. But my big question was, And this even goes back to the other comment you said, you're not a black male, you know, how positionality stuff, but it goes into can you say anything about access, working with these men, how to, in terms of what are if somebody wanted to do this kind of work, what advice would you have for them in terms of positionality, access, ethical work? How did you work with these men in terms of the decisions? Advice for others who would want to do this, or wherever you want to go.
So I have a few thoughts.
Cool.
And again, I did not know I would recruit only black males. That was not in the flyer at all. That's just how it happened. And so I had to be honest in terms of what experiences or what shared stories can I bring, right? Well, I have black brothers and nephews and sons, right? So I have to speak from that perspective of, from what I have observed in their experiences, what can resonate with what they're sharing with me. Or what would my wishes be for my sons? How do I want to protect them? And then in terms of positionality, I always, there are two moments during this research that I always share, just to show that I'm not perfect. And positionality is an issue sometimes when you do this type of work. And the first was when I was in a research conversation with one of my participants, and he was saying when he went to prison, and he was describing that initial moment. And even though I knew that he had been to prison, because obviously he volunteered to be in this research, but when he described walking into the facility, into the adult correctional facility, I was just like, man, you don't look like you've ever been to prison. And then immediately I had to ask myself, what image do I have in my head of what a person who has experienced prison looks like? And then I had to then reflect on, I have internalized some of what that dominant narrative and what society has told us a person who is worthy of incarceration looks like. And most of us have an image of a black male, a darker complected, maybe a larger build, right? Like, I had an image in my head, but because this man was brown skinned like me, had a smile like mine, I'm like, oh, you look too nice to go to prison, right? And that was something I had to interrogate within myself, of, I've internalized some of the same oppressive thinking. No matter all of my good intentions, it's still there. And then the other moment is when one of my participants and I were reading back his narrative. And, before we sat down, I was like, my goodness, do you know how hard it was to write your story? Like, I'm complaining. I'm like, I'm reading these transcripts, I'm transcribing, I am tired. And he said, you have the easy part. Do you know how hard it was to live it? And I was like, wow. Right? So I'm not perfect. But I created a space to where we were able to be honest in our thinking, where I felt comfortable sharing, like, oh, I messed up, or where they could correct me, like, nah, doc, you got that wrong. That's not what I meant. Um, and part of that it came about because of my vulnerability, my transparency, and my willingness to say, I've had these experiences, or I haven't had these experiences. Could you explain it more for me to understand? Or how are these the same or different? So I had to put a lot of myself on the table, just to be honest, like, because I was asking them to tell some really hard stories for my own personal gain. They weren't paid for this. Even though at the end, all of them said, man, this felt like therapy. I wish someone had asked me sooner. So they were happy to share, but, I had to be willing to share as well.
We have some questions coming in. One question from Sarah. As someone who does research drawing on stories, retelling the stories of others, how do we avoid representation versus representation?
I would need a little bit more clarity on
representation or representation versus representation. So the way she has it is RE dash presentation versus representation.
Yeah, I think you already
okay.
I'm sorry. I think you already touched a little bit on that, like the ethical considerations, and you said something really profound of like, I had to put myself on the table. And largely this is just coming from a question of most of the work that I do outside of autoethnography, that I do research in other parts of my life, draws on, language, non-English speaking languages. And one of the things that I felt was like, how do I honor my participants and recognizing the spaces that they're in and the experiences they've had, even though I myself can't understand, because I don't live that experience. That's not my identity. And so I worry about the retelling, the self-reflective process, right? Like the retelling of their story in a way that's authentic to them and doesn't put and I'll just be frank, like my whiteness on top of their story, like framing it through my eyes instead of framing it through theirs.
Oh, wow. Good question.
Yes. So what I did first was I just wrote their stories. Like I did not add any analysis or any of my thinking. I just wrote their stories and then I gave it back to them. And we met and we, sat down and it was simple things like because I tried to write in dialect the way they spoke it. And sometimes they would correct me and say, why would you put that? And I'm like, because that's how you said it. You have an accent. And, and he would say, well, everyone knows that's not what I meant, So then I would change it to what they wanted. And so once I felt that that I had captured their narrative in a way that they felt was acceptable, then I went back and I added my own analysis to it in terms of here's what I'm thinking. Here's what these experiences kind of mean to me or to our classrooms and teachers. Here's how the literature situates these particular experiences. So, and then honestly, if I felt that a story they shared would take away from the larger meaning I wanted to construct, I didn't include it. Because we have a responsibility. Once we share those stories, we can't control how people interpret them. And so if I felt there was a detail that may cause confusion and make people miss the larger structural issue, I just didn't include that particular detail. And the story was still able to hold its essence and its importance. Um, and part of that is protecting Black males and the mythology that surrounds Black males historically. So I had to make a lot of critical and conscious decisions just to be protective and honest.
I have a hand. There's a hand from Cassandra. If you want to ask your question, you may.
Yes, thank you very much. So my question is about Clarice. As you put it, you said that you put a lot on the table. So my question is, how did this affect you? How did this affect your emotions? What toll did these stories have on you?
I get that question every time. And honestly, it was hard. Um, Especially as I mentioned, I had sons at that time, so I was like hyper vigilant about anything when it came to, my boys being in school and like, oh my gosh, is this leading to the school to prison nexus? Like, how do I jump in and stop this? Or, do I need to show up? Or, like, so I internalized and took on a lot of what they were experiencing. And then I had to find relief for that. Like I had to get to a moment of saying, okay, step back, right? And of course, it was after everything was written. So it wasn't while I was in the middle of the research, but afterwards, I had to like kind of step back and not look at the research for probably a year. And just kind of decompress and recenter and, you know, get to a better mental space of, okay, you know, I had to take care of myself and step away because it was so difficult to hear these men talk about their families and how none of that was acknowledged when these school resource officers were handcuffing them at 8, 9 years old. It was difficult to hear a 18-year-old male walked into a prison and saw 10 of his classmates in prison, in an adult correctional facility. An entire neighborhood of Black children, because they were 18, had literally disappeared. There was no outcry for their absence. That was hard for me. And then for them to go to college and feel out of place. And I went right to college after high school, right? My path was not disrupted. Potentially could have been, but I had a smooth transition from one degree to another, to family life and all of these things. And to know that once someone goes to prison, we pretty much consider them disposable. We don't ask what happens after that experience. And so that's why it was important for me to focus on these men who decided to go back to college despite having that experience. Um, but I always thought about how many others could have these beautiful lives had their paths not been disrupted. And I took on a lot of that stress and strain in my spirit, honestly. And so yeah, I mean, I wish I had a better way of dealing with it at that time. I just didn't. So that's the honest answer.
I have a hand from Nikki Weldon. You may ask your question if you like.
Thank you. I so appreciate the couple of times, the few times that you've mentioned about protecting them and protecting their stories. And I feel as you know, as a Black woman doing research with Black families, Black students and Black families, that is my field as well. That we do feel a responsibility, and I just appreciate that you named it. I feel that as researchers, sometimes we get really caught up in what's truth, right? And telling it like it is. And I think that we have a responsibility to, especially for populations who have been oppressed and marginalized, to really nurture and protect. And I just wanted to say thank you for naming that.
Thank you. There was an I believe it was Eve Tuck's work that I looked at when I had to articulate why I made certain decisions. And I want to say it was a 2009 article where she specifically talks about that.
Any more questions?
Not really a question. I just wanted to give a comment. Your book is actually on my desk in my office. So I teach at A&T, we're HBCU, and I have master's of adult education program. And so actually by your book and one of my adjuncts, we're creating a special topics course in the fall that's going to focus on African American male college success. So your book is going to be part of that class. So I just wanted to give you a shout out and appreciate the work. So just really, I have like 2 thesis students who are getting ready to defend who have different variations of looking at, one's looking at masculinity and academic success and really Gen X and millennial African American males. And I have 2 coming up that are looking at academic higher education success. So I just appreciate the work. And so I just wanted to give you a shout out there. So thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And let me just shout out my moderator, Dr. Doss, who does a lot of work on Black male masculinity.
I know. I know. Look, I'm not gonna be like, I know you.
Or if you ever want to talk, I can always send you my email in terms of that class, because I actually teach a class on Black males as well.
Absolutely. That's something that's, like half of our master students right now, that is their, and so yeah, I'm always, I'd love to have, sure.
I also have another question coming in, and I may pronounce your name wrong, and excuse me for that. Sophia? Yes. And the question is, did you want to ask the question? You may. You want to. Oh.
Thank you. It's been so interesting to listen to your perspective. I'm hearing a lot of parallels for teaching in the Indigenous community in Canada, where, and I think there's similar challenges too around intersections of gender and race and the I guess first want to say, how do we work as allies to assist in this moment for what is going on, and refuse to be divided by the systems that would divide us. And the question was about finding what non-stupid optimism, sources of sustenance and solidarity, and how you like be in the real with these without like for me, the management is just zoom out, put it in an intergenerational perspective, right? But it drags you down, and how do you get up cheerful in the morning and continue, live to write another day?
Yeah, that is that's that's the hard part. But I will say, initially while I was doing the work, I read Erica Miner's book, Right to Be Hostile, and the fact that anger is a rightful emotion. And I was like, yes, so if these men expressed anger from their experiences, they had every right to, and acknowledging that. But then I didn't realize, until on the back end, that I would have my own anger. And like I said, I stepped away from the work for about a year. But during that year, what really started to put things into perspective is I read a lot of Afro pessimism. Um, and that particular framing kind of gave me the okay to be mad, but to not stop working. Like this acknowledgement of Black experiences across the entire diaspora are grounded in the transatlantic slave trade, right? While it may be an episode and that there was brilliance prior to this disruption, the reality is much of the people who are African descent across the whole diaspora have these anti-Black experiences. They have been commodified, they have been dehumanized, and that's just the reality. But now that we know that, now that we center that, how do we push forward? How do we keep doing the work? And so for me, Afro pessimism addressed the elephant in the room, right? And saying, okay, we know this is what it is. Now let's get busy. Let's work. Right. And so that's how I was able to come back to this research and just have like a different perspective of, while I'm not an Afro pessimist, it helped me. It was my therapy. um, I appreciated other people who were willing to name what I was feeling, because I didn't know. I just was frustrated. And so that naming helped me move forward. You're welcome.
Yes. Nelson, you have a question?
Thank you again. Writing stories is always challenging. And I was wondering if you could share some of your writing process as you put this book together.
Well, if I must be honest and put Tony on the spot here, Tony forced me to put a lot of my own self into this. I never wanted to feel like I was overshadowing the stories. And so I just wanted to tell their stories and move on, right? And then Tony was like, no. We need to see more of you in here. So and he said, you don't have to, but it's going to make this scholarship much stronger. And so that moment, I had to like really dig deep and say, okay, what are the critical moments in my own experiences as an educator, as a student, as a parent that kind of resonate and parallel with some of these experiences? And what does that mean for the overall story that I'm trying to tell and the work that I want to do with this particular book? So, and after I forced myself to think about my experiences and started writing, it came like it just poured in my mind. Like I was like, oh yes, and this, and this, and this. And so sometimes it's just a scholarly nudge that says, hey, we want to see more of you show up, and it's okay. And so yes, I have to give that credit to Tony Adams.
Except I remember this moment in your intro when I first read your manuscript, you were there and I knew you were there, and the stuff you were saying in there, you were there. So I'm just throwing that out.
Yes, but I wanted to just kind of drop in and leave. I didn't want to stay in the story. Just, like shout out me, hey, I'm here, and then, vacate. But and it worked out. And I think like the storied reflections that I have in between each chapter kind of helps sum up the previous moment, because it is a chronological story across three individuals. It kind of helps sum up and transition to the next moment. So and I get, and now looking back at it, it's like that's actually beautiful. Like I get to do that by sharing my own experiences and showing, yes, I am a researcher, but I'm also someone who has lived anti-Blackness. I am someone who has practiced in environments that are anti-Black. So it actually worked out.
Any other questions, comments? Yes, you go ahead, Sophie.
Do you ever include your sons in your work? Do they read it? What do they think about it?
My sons are 16 and 19. They don't care. They just want me to pay the bills. So no, they don't read it. And they actually will prefer if I stop talking about it. And now my daughter, who has a degree in African American Studies and actually took several classes with Dr. Doss as well. She's all into it. She's fully immersed. She kind of came of age with me doing this work, and I did not force her down any particular path, but it just kind of, maybe I talked about it so much that that's what she chose to do. But she's actually going the law school route, so she is about to study for the LSAT and go to hopefully get into someone's law school. So my boys are just kind of like, they probably think I'm too involved in the research, and they feel that I then try to regulate their actions because I know the possible outcomes. And so, because I'm more vigilant about, hey, don't walk in the community, or at night, or make sure if you're with your friends, like one of my participants said, if you're going to go play basketball, take two cars instead of being four cars or four Black males deep in one car. And so some of those things that I learned from them, I then apply to my sons, and they don't necessarily like it, but I'm like, hey, I have to protect you so that you come back home the same way I let you go out into the world.
Yes, yes. I have a question from Derek, and it says, in your interviews with these three men, did the experiences of the women in their lives come up and how they were impacted by what these men went through? That's a good question.
Yes. So every last one of them had women as their primary caregivers. For Raheem, it was his older sisters. Um, with Warren, it was his mother, although his father was involved, but his father also was incarcerated at some point. So he understood and that he was able to give him the tools he needed to kind of keep pushing forward because psychologically it was very hard for him once he got out of prison and knowing that that was never an experience that he planned, that he didn't know how to move past it initially. So his father's incarceration experience helped him move forward. And with Robert, um, his mother, his grandmother, his aunts, his cousins, like he had a very strong network of women who were there for him. And he tells the story of when he was in court and all of these women are in court with him crying and the judge is just like, you have your family in here crying. And he felt so bad because he knew that they cared about him and they loved him and they showed up for him, but there was absolutely nothing he could do to prevent for himself from going to prison at that moment. And so, or when his mother would show up to school and say, Robert, please just listen to these teachers. Please just do what they say. So they talk about the women with such reverence and love and um almost like, I don't want to say regret because they knew that they weren't intentionally getting into trouble, but trouble kept finding them, right? Um, and they just wanted to do right. They just wanted to go to school. They were trying to survive and things kept happening. And they never, even though most of their experiences were with like women teachers, they never had like an anger towards, these people. Not even, only like the school resource officer were the only one, or neighborhood officers were the only people they were like outright angry about how they were treated. But I think they could see elements of their family in the teachers and the administrators who were women. So they had, all of them had profound respect for women, Black women in particular. So
More questions? Let's see. Well, there any more questions, concerns, comments?
Hi, can I ask a follow-up one to that?
Absolutely.
So the insights from working on this book, do you feel like there are conclusions that can be learned to help reduce the recidivism rate? So obviously what you portray, like these are very insightful men that kind of have a very good sense of themselves. But like, do you feel like what you learn from doing this can maybe help inform how this system structures in this country can make sure that the rate of people kind of going back doesn't happen? Do you feel like what you learn from this can maybe help inform how we institute better structures, support those types of things?
yes, actually, to use Robert's story specifically, where he lived, they had youth offender legislation that if you were under 24 years old when you um, received a felony charge and went to prison, that as long as when you got out, you followed all of the conditions of your parole, didn't get into any more legal issues, you could have your record expunged. And so because he was 18 when he went to prison, and he was there for 2 years, and he was released when he was 20, and he followed all of those conditions, he was able to get his record expunged. And now he's a sociology professor. He has a PhD. So more legislation like that. And I would say where Raheem and Warren lived, they had the exact same legislation. They just weren't able to, they violated their parole, so, or probation. So they didn't get the opportunity to have their records expunged. But it's really at the criminal legal system level that, in terms of on the back end, how we can stop or prevent recidivism is giving people the opportunity, like Robert said, it was the opportunity to feed himself, and not just physically, but with knowledge. Like, he didn't want to starve in either capacity. So as long as he was able to go to school and go to work and have access, right? Access to opportunities, he was able to continue the path that he initially set out on. And I would say, now Raheem and Warren have been able to still get their degrees and do community work and all of that. They do all of that work with felonies still on their criminal records. And that's something that, for the most part, doesn't prevent them um, from doing the work they want to do, but it does create limitations to what they could do. Um, Raheem always talked about he wanted to be a governor, and he said, but you know what, Doc? I don't think they're gonna let me be a governor with this felony. And I'm like, well, now we don't know, right? The entire things have changed, so maybe, right? But that was something that was always in the back of their minds of, how do I navigate around this felony status? Now I have the degree, but I still have to navigate this piece. And so that's truly, it's a balancing act of, not that felony status dehumanizes people in terms of taking away their right to vote, where they can live, where they can work. But the more that we can start to alleviate some of those barriers, I think that will reduce recidivism. What I would like to see is that we prevent the incarceration or the, felony status to begin with. And that takes all of us in the work that we do. We don't need legislation to tell us to do right by people. We just have to enact practices that don't disrupt people's pathway and create access to those same opportunities without incarceration or arrest being part of the equation, because it's not a natural pathway to adulthood for Black males. There is nothing natural about incarceration.
Other questions?
Oh,
all right.
Yes, one quick one. Thank you so much. My name is Sarah Kitonsa, and I'm attending from. So apart from Tony making you put yourself in the story, I'm wondering what advice you would give someone like me. So my story is this: I did my PhD in research that started with me. I really wanted to write my story as a way of highlighting systemic challenges that highly skilled immigrant women experience coming to the US. But I felt shy. I thought that it would be so ingratiating to put myself front and center of my story. And so I did a narrative study, which was very eye-opening. I interviewed 14 women. And so now I'm at this stage of wanting to transition, to blend my story with theirs to tell the bigger story. What advice would you give me as I move forward?
So the advice I would give you for blending your story with the 14 women, I would say, see where your experiences maybe overlap or differ. And if you can add an additional voice to what they've already expressed, or if what they're sharing with you makes you think about your own experiences in a different way and as a different interpretation. Because you don't have to tell the exact same story, because you may not have the exact same experiences, but you still have to make meaning of what you have experienced in your life. And however you can get those to come together, whether it's a theme, whether it's chronology, if you experience this at a particular time, or if there is a theme that's overarching across your experiences, if there's a place like a region, or if you have shared likes or dislikes, like, there's so many different ways that you can layer your story onto theirs. You just have to kind of sit with it and think about what are the best representation of the full story, and also, what do you want people to get from it? How do you want people to read it and then use it? Because once you give the stories to people, you cannot control what they think. You cannot control anything once it's out in the world. And no matter what you meant to say, all that matters is what they think. And as Dr. Doss always says, you never want to live in people's imaginations. So be very clear about what you want people to get from your story and why you're putting it there.
Good one.
See, I listen to you sometimes.
Yes. Any other questions, comments?
I just want to say this was a phenomenal I want to call it a workshop, partial workshop on method and consideration. Like, brilliant.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I just have to thank you all for being here and asking these questions. And I did not know what to expect. So the only thing I can do is just be honest. And so thank you for asking questions that I can honestly answer.
Yes. And get the book if you haven't gotten it. Get the book.
Yes, get the book.